On June 21st, 2025, the business world lost a giant. FedEx founder Fred Smith passed away at the age of 80. Like anyone who manages to have an outsized impact on their space, Smith was a complex character, but there can be no question that he changed our supply chains forever. And so, in this episode of Art of Supply, I'll share a bit about Fred Smith's personal and professional background. We'll relive the obstacles and successes involved in the founding of Federal Express, and we'll consider some of Fred Smith's most insightful perspectives on supply chain and business. Going back to the very beginning, Frederick Wallace Smith was born in Marks, Mississippi in 1944. Now, as the story goes, he very first imagined FedEx as an assignment while studying at Yale. He wrote a paper about a company that was able to provide overnight delivery. And supposedly, he got a C on the assignment. Now, this isn't necessarily a critique on his writing skills, but his professor found the premise improbable. Now, if we can find a way to time travel, more of us would probably be aligned with that professor than it seems like we would be today. At the time, pre air travel deregulation, air freight was carried in the bellies of passenger planes. It was definitely a secondary consideration. And if you think about it, the needs of air freight and the needs of passenger travel are completely different. Chances were at the time, if anybody had to win out in that struggle, it was not going to be the air freight. Even beyond the air transportation, shippers would have to coordinate with ground transportation to actually move those packages to their end destination. Now, what Smith saw was not necessarily the logistical advantages of air freight. What he saw was a need that was starting to emerge, or a market that was opening up between the emergence of high tech sectors as well as medical devices. He believed these companies would be willing and able to pay for speedy, direct shipments that would no doubt be costly, but there was still a benefit to them to taking that approach. Now, we have a little bit of a pause in between when Fred Smith had this idea and when he started to turn FedEx into a reality. After he graduated from Yale, he served 2 tours in Vietnam. As part of the Marines, he was a platoon leader, he was a forward air controller, and he earned a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts. It was actually a point of pride to Smith that he never went to business school. He considered the Marines his business school. Now, there was some overlap there beyond just learning to be resilient and tough. He had the opportunity to observe military procurement and logistics procedures carefully. And always he had that C graded paper in the back of his mind and the business idea that went along with it. He continued to take in information and think about how he might create a network that could support overnight commercial delivery. After Vietnam, he came right back to the idea in that college paper. In 1971, he launched FedEx, which wouldn't actually start operating until 1973. Initially, the company started in Little Rock, Arkansas, but then they eventually moved to Memphis, Tennessee for better location and weather. Now, it's expensive to get a business like this off the ground. Smith managed to raise $80 million in VC money, plus a few loose million from friends and family. At the time, it was the largest private investment package ever put together. Now, on their first night in operation, they moved 186 packages on 14 jets to 25 cities. Let's put that in context. By 2023, FedEx moved an average of 16.5 million packages every day. Now, that massive growth shouldn't suggest that there were no challenges. In those first 2 years of operation, FedEx lost $27 million. They were basically burning $1 million a month. But Fred Smith managed to continually renegotiate the company's bank loans to keep them afloat. Now, let's just pause and think about that for a minute. It's the 1970s, and you are losing $1 million a month. I can't even imagine the stress, let alone the determination associated with trying to get through that kind of a challenge. Fortunately, Fred Smith was bolder and braver than I am. By 1976, the company started to turning a profit. A huge part of making that possible was their hub and spoke system for how they actually managed the transportation of those parcels. Now, by flying smaller planes, FedEx managed to stay under the radar of regulations, but it also kept their growth. It wasn't truly until the airline industry was deregulated that they managed to expand into larger aircraft and the growth of the company took off. That deregulation arrived in 1978. And in truth, FedEx never would have been able to grow the way they did if the government hadn't have gotten out of the way. Now, that deregulation took place under President Jimmy Carter, and it basically removed the federal government from approving routes and also approving the prices that go along with air transportation. They also abolished the Civil Aeronautics Board. The reality is that opened the door to FedEx buying larger planes, setting their own prices, and by 1983, their revenue was over $1 billion dollars a year. As Fred Smith would say later on, quote, "The economics were huge for us. The bigger an aircraft, the lower the cost per pound. The yields with the Falcons carrying 6,000 pounds were fine. We made money. But the amount of money we could make with the larger airplane was exponential to us." Now, in 1994, FedEx became the first transportation company to offer website based tracking and tracing that was available to customers. That's something we very much take granted today, but at the time, it was not just revolutionary, it was incredibly challenging to make possible. In 2019, FedEx decided that Amazon was becoming a bit too much of a competitor and terminated their contract. Now, that's something Fred Smith would later change his mind about. In 2022, he stepped down as CEO but became chairman of the board. This company and Fred Smith introduced a number of innovations over the years, many of which we're still using today. One of Fred Smith's favorite things to say was, "The fundamental thing that everybody in business has always got to realize in a market driven economy is that you're in the process of being commoditized." So rather than being one specific innovation, I think Fred Smith's largest contribution was actually his perspective on business innovation itself. He liked employees who brought him cost savings ideas. He got involved personally when large customers complained about the service that they were receiving. And for instance, when new sources of competition were introduced, such as when digital documents started to cut into overnight document deliveries, the company pivoted. In that case, building a ground network and moving into e commerce deliveries. There were even other businesses whose models were made possible by FedEx's willingness and ability to innovate. For instance, Dell computers. I know we're looking back a little bit here, but the speed with which you could get your Dell computer that you had ordered at your doorstep was absolutely mind boggling. And Dell would not have been able to achieve that without FedEx's shipment network. Now, I mentioned earlier that they led the way with package tracking and tracing. To make that one thing possible, they had to invent all kinds of different things. Now, this wasn't just having a unique identifier that could be stuck on a package. It actually had to contain, between codes and numbers and information on the package, all of the different steps. Now, remember, this hub and spoke model means it's not just going from Boston to Orlando or New York to Los Angeles. You're actually going through regional hubs to major national areas, and all of that information has to be contained on the sticker. As Smith explained, quote, "There had been barcodes that said, 'I'm a can of tomato soup,' but nobody had ever made a 5-part air bill that had a number that said, 'I'm 12345,' and then stick it on the package. Then we tried to have a little device that could read it." Now, that device is the other piece of what they had to innovate. Warehouses, airplane operators, truck drivers, they all had to be able to decode the information stuck to the side of the package. Those devices, according to Smith, started about the size of a bread box. Ironically, that's not even something that necessarily translates today. Just think much bigger than you would want a handheld device to be, and did end up being about the size of a phone today. So, all of the computing and connectivity that goes with that had to be created by FedEx. Now, of course, that is above and beyond the hub and spoke system that they innovated. This was always part of Smith's vision. He imagined a system where shipments from across the country could all be funneled into a single central location every night, sorted quickly and efficiently, and then loaded onto planes bound for regional airports so that that final delivery could take place. Before this practice went into use, more direct routes were being used. Now, even though this might make it possible for one package to get from point A to point B a little bit faster, it was far less efficient and way more expensive. The reason that hub and spoke is so much faster, even though packages are traveling further, is because regional points are more likely to face delays than national hubs. And you can be a little bit more thoughtful about where you put those national hubs, thinking about both speed and usability, just like his move into Nashville, Tennessee. A hub and spoke model is also more scalable because the hubs can take increased volume more easily than regional stop points can. Think about the holiday shopping season, for instance, or back to school. You're going to have a massive surge of packages traveling through, and you have to be able to scale to still meet delivery expectations and get that volume of packages through. Today, FedEx Express has 15 global hubs, FedEx Ground has 50, and FedEx Freight, their LTL operation, has 60. Now, it's interesting to think about how Fred Smith saw FedEx. Yes, his paper that he got that C on was based on the idea of overnight commercial delivery. But if you were to ask him, what sort of a company is FedEx? He was not going to say a logistics firm. He always saw FedEx as being in the information business. That certainly goes back to his idea about tracking and tracing, the scan bars, the handheld devices. He always believed that having that information about origin, knowing where the package was at any given time, having information about the destination it was headed to, even in terms of the weather that might affect that delivery, was absolutely as critical as the equipment and the people that made it possible to get those packages there. Now, part of how Fred Smith saw his company is so critical comes back to that earlier question of Amazon. So, as time went on, Smith no longer saw Amazon as a competitor. And this may be a sign that he was less changing how he saw Amazon and more changing how he saw FedEx. It isn't just delivery and logistics. Amazon is a retailer, first and foremost. Yes, they have an impressive logistics network now extending all the way to final mile delivery. But that's not the core of what they do. At least in terms of when Smith was looking at it, they didn't have the network model that FedEx and more direct competitors like UPS do. Now, this idea of being an information company even extends beyond tracking and tracing the packages themselves. Here's another example. Back in 1982, Ron Anderson, who was vice president of aircraft acquisitions and sales at FedEx from about 1974, near the beginning of the company, until the early 90s, helped Smith set up something called FedEx Express Aviation Services. So basically, what they did is they hired a group of software engineers and asked them to create a database for compiling data on aircraft trading activity. They published monthly data about the global air fleet and listings of available aircraft. Now, when it came to buying used aircraft and incorporating them into the fleet, all of this information absolutely gave FedEx a leg up on their deals. Over time, they also started selling that data to other parties who were able to benefit from it as well. As Smith said later, we now have customers who are essentially buying just our digital services, not our transportation services. Even looking at the different types of facilities in the network was something that Fred Smith saw differently. At an MIT interview taped right near the end of his life, he talked about warehouses being non-value add. Now, that is not to say that warehouses don't have value. They just don't add value to the service or the product. If you can store packages in a way that moves them closer to their destination while they're being stored, like on a truck, that adds value to the customer. Now, to make that possible, you have to have all of that data and tracking and tracing in place. So, what it basically allows you to do is instead of having that package sitting in a warehouse waiting for its turn to get on a truck or a plane, it's always moving closer to the destination. Now, even though FedEx saw themselves as an information company, they absolutely drove change in the parcel delivery space. And one of the places we see this most directly is the competitive impact they had on the US Post Office. Now, in the 1970s, frankly, the post office was a mess. Costs were going up, their service was considered poor, and they hadn't invested in equipment in decades. At the time, they were running a deficit of more than $1 billion a year, which was thought of as catastrophic. Now, of course, in 2024, they lost almost $10 billion, which makes $1 billion sound quaint. But we do have to remember this was 50 years ago. Now, seeing this opportunity, Smith stepped in and FedEx started offering a service that was able to more reliably deliver those packages, even if it cost more. And for the right customers, a little bit of added expense didn't actually matter as long as the package arrived on time. And as a bonus, they knew where it was every step of the way. The post office had no choice but to respond. They started upgrading systems and they started offering tracking services, something that has certainly become more ubiquitous today. But at the time, it prevented them from continuing down the path that they were on. Now, some of my favorite reading in the memorial articles about Fred Smith included this idea of an innovation mindset. He had a few pieces of advice that he talked about regularly and how he embedded that innovative approach at FedEx. His first piece of advice, I think this is hysterical. He says you have to learn to tolerate characters. I don't mean letters, I don't mean Mickey Mouse. I mean the idea that great ideas often come from odd places. So if you want to have an innovative team, you have to have some quirky folks in the ranks and deal with all of the complexities and unexpected things that go with having people like that on your team. You have to be able to tolerate failure. Thinking back to that $1 million loss per month in 1973 and 74, clearly Fred Smith was an expert at tolerating failure, but he didn't let it get him down and he continued to overcome those obstacles. Now, finally, and this is something I've already mentioned, he was consistent about the idea that a failure to change dooms you to not be able to succeed at all. He constantly talked about this idea that we're all constantly up against the pressure of commoditization. And he talked about the idea of how they went from those few packages to the 16 million a day. He said, quote, we got from that 189 packages to $100 billion in revenue because we're very analytical and we do understand you have to change. And to change means, particularly in this day and time, to innovate. And to innovate in this day and time, it means adopting leading edge technology. With all of these positive and impressive memories of Fred Smith and his innovations and his military service and what he managed to achieve, it's also fair to remember that in 2022, the year that Smith stepped down from his role as FedEx CEO to become chairman of the board, is the same year that everything hit the fan in the FedEx ground subcontractor network. You may remember Spencer Patton and the proposed Purple Friday strike that never materialized because a major lawsuit was levied by FedEx against Spencer Patton. We ended up with dueling lawsuits in that case, and Patton is the one that prevailed in the end. Now, you don't get to Fred Smith's level without being tough, and he was, after all, only human. His passing absolutely marks the end of an era. As Smith himself said, quote, life is short and it ends. The clock is ticking. Don't get all wrapped up in your personal self. That's a very unhealthy thing to do. And that is solid advice that rings true from a person who knows it better than most.